All right. We will have a very, very short talk tonight because I only had so much time to put together. We are looking at the first three labors tonight, and the first labor is the slaying and the flaying of the Nemean lion, which was an enormous beast, much bigger than most other beasts. And it had a pelt that was impermeable. It was impermeable to bronze or iron or stone. Now, various different people have different ideas about the origin of the Nemean lion. Some believe that it was a child of Typhon. And you remember when we talked about the dark children of the sea, some people felt that it was a offspring of the Chimera and of Othos, the huge big dog. And some people thought that it was the offspring of Selene, the moon goddess, and some people thought that Selene made it out of sea foam. In any case, the fact that it belongs to Typhon was sort of the, I can give you little notions about each of these outlooks. Typhon represented the lower nature, and as we saw, Osiris represented the higher nature, and some people would say that the Nemean lion was a product of the lower nature. In the case, if you're looking at it as a offspring of Chimera and Orthus, it's the whole idea that one elemental force metamorphizes into another. That is to say, every thought and feeling that we have produces a form in the etheric world. Not quite so distinct as the forms in the material world, but thoughts and feelings of a similar kind, having a similar planetary root, seem to cling together and they form elemental beings within our being. And those elemental beings have the capability of metamorphizing from one shape to another into another. Evidently, when people unfold clairvoyance or only unfold a limited degree of clairvoyance, that they see the form of inner world entities, what happens is they actually do see beasts and monsters. If it is associated with Selene, it is associated with the lower nature, but the lower nature as an instinctual natural force, which is what Selene represented, and obviously taking something and building it out of sea foam was a notion of building something out of the ethers. But at any rate, the Nemean lion lived near the city of Nemea, and it had its lair. It had in a cave that had two openings. It had a front door and it had a back door, and that cave was on Mount Tritus. We'll look a little bit at the cave a little bit later, but it's a common theme in mythology. But at any rate, Heracles comes to Cleone, which is another city on the flanks of Mount Tritus, not a city, actually a little town. And he lives with a shepherd who is the father of one of the victims. His son, who was herding sheep, was killed by the Nemean lion. And he gives shelter to Heracles, and Heracles leaves, and the chap is about to make a sacrifice of one of his lambs to Hera, and this sort of has Heracles a little bit aghast, and he says, don't make any sacrifices yet, wait 30 days, and if I come back sacrifice to Zeus, and if I don't come back, sacrifice to me as a martyr. So Heracles goes closer onto the mountain, and he comes to the town of Nemea itself. And when he gets to Nemea, he finds nobody there. The town is deserted because everybody is afraid of being attacked by the lion. The 1 month period clearly has something to do with some activities are best done allowing one entire cycle of the moon. Like, for example, if you're doing some counseling with someone and you need to allow them a certain amount of time to think something through or to experience something fully before they can do much to change their life, I usually choose a period of time that has some kind of astrological significance to them. If a person is about to do something that is of immediate consequence and they just can't seem to wait, I try to get somebody to wait at least 3 days, because then the moon will have gone through one sign and have entered another sign, and their outlook will be a little bit different, and they won't be coming with the same attitudes. What is usually preferable, though, is to go through one whole moon, or even better, 1/2 of a year, as we've talked about with esoteric and exoteric things. But at any rate, Heracles spies the lion, and when he spies the lion, he decides to attack right away. And so he shoots a whole quiver full of arrows at it, and the arrows just bounce off of it. They don't do a thing. So he goes up to it, and he attacks it with his sword, and his sword bends double. And so he figures he'll go to his mainstay, the thing that helped him to defeat the other lion, and that was his club, which, remember, he cuts these out of wild olive trees, and he takes this big club and clobbers it over the head, and all it does is shakes its head and keeps right on going, and he can't harm it. The whole notion is that if the arrows represent projected thoughts, it means that this beast, which represents, as we're looking at it, the vital body, is to some extent not easily overcome by thought alone. He also tries the sword, which is a more direct, two-edged, bladed kind of thinking, and that doesn't slay it either. And just brute force of will is not enough to do it either. So, what he has, he's then forced to having to take more direct means. And so what he does is he goes to the other side of the mountain, and he takes a net, and he closes up one side of the cave, and he goes in the other side of the cave, sort of like a Daniel in the lion's den sort of thing, and he wrestles with it. And what he does is he puts a headlock on it, and when he puts a headlock on it, he holds it until he chokes it to death. And that's how he defeats the lion, and he was probably the first wrestler in history to use the headlock. And after that, it once caught on with big-time wrestling on TV. Ever after, it's been standard fare. Mystically, not only in Plato, but Plato is probably one of the best sources. If you remember from the Republic of Plato, there is the allegory of the cave, where we are down in a cave and we are facing the back wall of the cave, and all we ever see are shadows when people go by with torches. And he likens the path of mysticism from being unbound in our cave and turning around and facing the sunlight and actually walking out into the light, because all that we see are mere reflections and materialistic illusions. the cave has always been the symbol of the physical world, meaning to say that it is a pocket in the side of a mountain, or it is a pocket in the side of a higher kind of consciousness, and in that we dwell sort of ignorant of the greater mass in which we exist, the higher kind of intelligence. In this case, we have a rather classic symbol which was interpreted in a mystical way by the Neoplatonist Porphyry in the Cave of the Nymphs, which is a comment on the Odyssey, mystical commentary on the Odyssey. In this case, it seems very likely that any of the inner worlds between the highest and the lowest could be considered a two-way cave. That is, with two entrances, because there are two flows. There is the extrovertive flow that passes from the world of spirit into matter, and there is the introverted flow that it passes from the external world, from the material world, back into spirit. One is originated in spirit and uses the vehicle of thought. The other originates in matter and it uses the vehicle of rethinking or memory. And blocking up one of the tunnels, in effect, means that something is closed off. Now, this is something that this is a very speculative kind of thing, and in effect, he's made the etheric world something like the physical world. Now, which end of the cave is closed off is the part that makes for the interesting speculation. In some ways, one could say that the spiritual end is closed off, that which, where the stream of consciousness proceeds from the spiritual worlds down into the etheric body. And if that's the case, what one would think then is that one would be confronted with a sensory kind of life. That is, where one would have to very objectively struggle with the etheric body as the vehicle of the senses. And by having objective consciousness from the facts of the external world as they feed into the ethers, one could then overcome the etheric consciousness by controlling what comes in. Because clearly the etheric body is a body that, if left to its own, it is a rather lethargic body. Even though it represents vitality, it really doesn't want to be set into action. It wants to grow, and it wants to assume more and more impressions from the world of senses, more and more memory, and it wants to transport things through it, but it really isn't an active vehicle. I would go with that way of looking at it, because it would clearly be that if you netted off the top end or the inner end of the cave, what would be happening is you would be shutting it off from the spiritual realms. And what I tend to think is, I don't think that this necessarily represents sensory deprivation, but it means cutting off the constant influx of sensory experience, which can be distracting and which tend to be illusory, and actually taking the stuff of the etheric body and organizing it and getting in control of it. Because if you look at that, that's what actually happens, for example, in the morning exercises of Rosicrucian students. The entire effort is to, without appealing to the senses or without using the vital body to activate the physical body at all, to be wide awake in the waking state, but to focus the attention in on the etheric vehicle. So one is then in effect not shut out the external world as in sensory deprivation, but just does not pay any attention to it. And so the whole process then of getting control of the vital body is not to be distracted and not to be carried away with the new impressions that are coming into it, but more or less to, with the spirit, take and get complete control of it and deal with it on its own. The choking then makes more sense, because then it is cut off from having more and more things what it feeds on. Now, again, the length of time that this takes, supposedly some people think it takes 1 month, but other versions of the story say that it takes an entire year. But as a result, he does eventually accomplish it. And the word eventually is the correct word, because none of these things are easy things to accomplish. The physical body is the most difficult to change, because how does the Bible say it? Who among you by taking thought can change his stature by 1 inch? Meaning to say that the physical body is pretty well determined, and to make a major change in the physical body is difficult. The next most complex and ramified and removed from the divine is the etheric body, and that therefore it must also be, because of its proximity or its distance from the direct spiritual consciousness, it must be the next most difficult to work with. And I think if you try changing habits, you'll find that to be the case. That it's easy to move from one kind of thought to another kind of thought, but to change to a different rhythm in your vital nature takes a considerable amount of time. In fact, I think to really change the etheric nature without even building the vital body or the soul material of the vital body, I think is something that takes several lives before it's all completely done. During the course of this struggle with the lion bites off one of his fingers. This is also a common theme in mythology, that heroes very often have 9 fingers, not 7 or 5 or 4, but they have 9 fingers, and this is, I think, either to represent their humanity or to represent the 9 lesser mysteries. In either because 9 on one hand is the number of humanity, but 9 is also the number of steps or stages that are definitive stages within our internal constitution, that they're literally like steps on a ladder. They represent distinct changes in the way our bodies have come to be by involutionary steps, and so that each of the initiations is related to that. And it's just another hint that this is a mysteries myth and not just another wild fighting story. But at any rate, he picks up the big beast and puts it on his shoulders, and he returns to Cleone just at about the time that Molarchus is about to sacrifice to him, being a dead martyr. And so what he says is, all right, we'll both sacrifice to Zeus, and they both sacrifice to Zeus, and the people will come back to Nemea, and Heracles sets up the Nemean Games in honor of Zeus, and to some extent in his own honor. That's the thing about heroes, is they recognize their divinity in such a way that it's easy to almost look at them as gigantic egoists, but they do it. But at any rate, he brings the beast back, and when he comes back to Mycenae, Eurystheus is so frightened by his arrival, because he's become so strong now and he's frightened by having this big beast because he just comes and drops the big lion at his feet. And Eurystheus commands him that from now on he's got to stay outside the city gates when he has completed his work. This is a very common theme that takes place in all mythologies. We're going to run into it in another one of the myths that we look into, and that is that very often there is, as a parent or as a step-parent for the hero, there is a shrunken, dwarf-like, coward-like person who puts him through his paces. And that's sort of the way it is. The lower nature, which is small and tiny compared to the macrocosmic quality of the higher nature, which is as great as the universe, the lower nature has these overweening ambitions and all of these desires. This lower egoistic self, it figures it's going to be God and it's going to have others really kowtowing to it. And because the vehicles of the self are in some ways so pliable and suggestible and things like that, there's something in the grandiose notions of the lower nature that it thinks that it is really divine, and it thinks it's actually going to pull this off. And what happens is there is the statement, like it says in the Bible, and the wise shall be captured in their folly. And the lower nature eventually does get captured. But what happens then is Eurystheus is so frightened that what he does is he has, in the palace, he has the floor taken up, and they dig down, and they put this great big brazen urn in the floor, and every time he hears the ground shaking from Heracles coming back, he takes refuge down in this brazen urn. And it's just a little sideline anecdote of the story, but that's sort of the way it is. There is some truth to the notion of the Taoists that if you make a good man, that you by the same stroke produce a bad man. I don't really believe it quite that way. But what happens is that, relatively speaking, as the self or the hero part of ourself rises to apotheosis, the lower part of ourselves becomes more and more timid and more frightened, and it would go underground. It would hide itself under the earth in brazen material, which would want to take refuge in its sins. And I myself can speak for that. I'm one that very much likes to take refuge in my sins. And sometimes when it seems when I'm most on the urge of doing something spiritually, I have to go back and take refuge in my sin du jour, you might say. And I had a friend that was like that. He had an out-of-the-body kind of dream with somebody who was he met these invisible helper types of beings, and he was way up in the inner worlds, and they were going to take him somewhere really exquisite. He said, "No, I can't go. I got to go back and get something to eat." And then he came back to his physical body, and he was greatly discouraged about it all. So he decided he would never go to bed without eating a big meal first. So he never had to do that again. And obviously, he got caught in his own wiles. And what happens is that if he ate a big meal before going to bed, he clearly couldn't go into the inner worlds because he'd have to stay with the physical body and be taking care of that. But at any rate, only part of the task was accomplished when he slayed the Nemean lion. The other part, which proved to be much more difficult, was the flaying of the Nemean lion. And he didn't know how to do it. And as I recall, I think he fasted several days because all of the implements of humans wouldn't work to cut through the skin. And his command was that he had to flay it. And then intuitively it comes to him that what he has to do is flay it using its own claws. Now, This is a very central principle that is two ways in this. It's a central principle of both psychology and of spiritual growth in terms of interpreting myths and in terms of doing something with our inner constitution so we can actually get somewhere and unfold the facilities or the faculties to be able to really help people instead of just being ordinary human beings. If you recall, what he had to do with the lion was he actually had to go into its lair. And when he came to flay it, he actually had to use the lion's own claws to flay it. And this is the most central principle of the entire spiritual life, that each plane and each vehicle that we have that corresponds to that plane must be approached on and by itself. That is to say, you can't use the vital body to overcome the desire body to overcome the vital body. The desire body can tire it out, and the physical body can provide ultimate resistance to it, but ultimately to gain control of the soul body as part of the etheric body especially, you have to use the principles that are part of that body itself. And therefore, what he did in order to overcome it is by the force of concentration. He got a hold of the fluidic control of the incessant life inside of the vital body. And that is the fluidic properties of the vital body work by rhythms. And I don't mean only repetitions, because repetitions do set up rhythms. All of those things like chantings and things like that do set up rhythms where you can begin to control it, and by changing habits. But actually you get inside the life itself and you begin to understand the flow. For example, if you are a magnetic healer, the magnetic healing that you do, you get inside the energies, and when you lay hands on someone, you can polarize your own etheric vehicle, that you can draw the etheric energy that is clogging another person, the miasma, you can actually draw that off of another person. And you do that by getting inside of life itself. And that's what is involved in the process of flaying it. You cut it, because if you look at it, the claws of the lion are just like waves. This is one of the reasons why, they're shaped like a wave, which is the reason why a bear claw is such a sacred thing to the Native Americans, because they represent that lunar wave-like principle, and the wave is the tool that works inside the etheric body. If you wake up tired, you take a little 5-minute nap and you catch another wave of energy in the etheric body, you can get up and you can go for the rest of the day. So after the lion has been flayed, he has completed his labor, and ever after he wears the pelt. In fact, he's known, even the various picturings that have been of Heracles in the pictorial zodiac show him wearing the lion's pelt. And this is clearly that this is the etheric body. Once he's gotten into it, and once he's made it his own, this is sort of like the attainment of the adamant. If you remember from alchemy, one gets to the point where one has produced the diamond soul body. And it involves the same sort of thing. It involves taking carbon, because carbon represents the earth more than any other element. And when you take the earth and organize it to its highest state, you get diamond. And when you have the diamond heart, it's like what you're doing is you're eating up the earth itself through your perceptions, and you're organizing those perceptions through repetitive processes and organizing them in such a way that all of your experience especially the experience of service, is in the two higher ethers of the vital body, and then one has the diamond soul body, or the adamant. This gets away from those very fearful, selfish notions about psychic self-defense. And with psychic self-defense, people try to protect themselves from other people practicing magic on them and such like that. And that's utterly foolish, because when you start getting into fearful things like that, there are precautions to be taken. But when you start getting into fearful things, that fear makes you more susceptible to attack than if you just live an ordinary life. Moreover, if you start closing yourself off, you close yourself off both from experience in the outer world and from a clean flow of energy from the inner worlds. And if you start doing that, you've lost, because you've then accepted, or you've then taken on a life of ignorance. That's just the thing we're trying to get away from, is ignorance. And so he has organized that, and he comes to the diamond soul body. That's about all I have to say about the first of the three labors we're looking into tonight. I'll have less to say about each of them as we go successively. That's the way things are. The second labor is the labor of the Lernaean Hydra. If you remember again, this is another one of the children of Typhon and Echidna, one of the dark children of the sea. And if I'm not mistaken, all of us have a very large number. Of course, the Medusa, which was another of the dark children of the sea, is the ultimate of the elementals that we have in our inner constitution, but we have a good number of them, and they're produced by wrong thinking, wrong feeling, and wrong action. But Lernaea is in the southwest peninsula, not on the isthmus, but in the southeast part of the Greek peninsula, and it's near the sea, near Argos, and it's near Mount Pontanus. And Mount Pontanus, the flanks of Mount Pontanus run down to the sea. And on the slopes of that are many plane trees, and plane trees are something like our hackberries. If you're familiar, have you ever seen a hackberry? It's a plant it's a tree that's in the elm family, only it has smaller leaves. It's more like a brush, and it grows in fence lines. You find some in Wisconsin here, but you find more like in the Ozarks in Missouri. And it produces a fruit that is about the size of an orange. And that fruit is green, more like yellow-green, like a chartreuse, only not bright chartreuse, and it's fuzzy, slightly fuzzy, and it's convoluted. It looks like a brain. The whole thing looks like a brain. In fact, it's a folk remedy for cockroaches, that if you get hackberry fruit and you shatter them into pieces, and it has nothing to do even with the books. It's one of those kinds of nights again. And put the pieces of hackberry fruit out around your area, that it'll repulse cockroaches for a long time. It's one of the natural means for dealing with them. But the hackberry trees run down the side of the slope right to the swamp, and I don't know whether it is a saline swamp or whether it is a freshwater swamp. But one of the trees right down near the edge of the swamp is the swamp itself is a quagmire. You know, it feels like you could walk on it, but you really can't. It's too thick to take a boat through and too thin to walk through. And near one of the trees is where a sevenfold river source is, and under that tree is where the Lernaean Hydra dwelt. And it spent a lot of time in the swamp, and this brings up things like Loch Ness monsters and things like that, which I don't really want to go into, but I do believe there might be a few remnants of dinosaurs. I'm more likely to believe the stories of the Congo than I am of Scotland, because conditions in the Congo are such that a cold-blooded beast like that could still exist. But it had a huge dog-like body and many heads. Some people think it had 7 heads. Some people think it had 8. Some people think it had 9. And some people have numbers as many as 10,000 heads. The thing about the heads was that they were, one of them was the primary head. And all of the others had something like immortality, such that if you cut off one, more came in its place. At least one, but usually more. And so we're having to deal, we're saying, the way we looked at it last week in the introduction to the labors, we're saying that the first 3 labors are vehicular, or that's the way we're going to look at them, that they relate to the etheric body, the desire body, and the mind, and that the Lernaean Hydra relates to the desire body. And a quagmire is really a way to describe the desire body and to describe the desire world, because in a way it isn't quite trustworthy, because desire is such a thing that, different from the etheric world where the poles are at least conceptually separated, in the desire world the poles are united in such a way that it seems almost unipolar or monopolar, and you're on very, very soggy ground, something that you can't really rely on, especially at our state of development. I've just had the thought again several times in the last few weeks that my desire nature, my feeling nature, is not really well developed. It's not that I'm a beast out of control with all kinds of raging desires. I'll admit to that too, but even that isn't that great. There's not enough, there's not really a whole lot of passion there. But it's not developed in that, if you take all of the potential kinds of feelings that a human being can have, if you look in poetry or music or art or something like that, you have people that have all of these different kinds of emotions. They have many spectra of emotions, and I'm pretty gray, relatively speaking, and don't have all of those kinds of feelings. Obviously, the heads relate to the 7 vortices of the desire body. And the 7 vortices of the desire body relate to the 7 basic planets, which themselves are pouring desire material. They are themselves vortices that pour desire material into the macrocosmic desire world. The whole notion, this is sort of like a notion of repression, that if you try to repress and stop a desire, it just comes out somewhere else in another form. That you really can't ultimately overpower it. In fact, I don't think you really want to. You don't want to kill motivation. The one head that is the immortal head for us is probably the one that springs out of the liver, because corresponding to the liver is a focus or the primary vortex of the desire body. In our desire body, we have only one outpouring vortex. And all of the desire material in our desire body pours out through that vortex and goes back within the withinness of the desire body through the other 6 vortices. Whereas I think in like the divine beings, all of them are outpouring because they're positively motivated and they're creative beings, and their motivations aren't to get something and attract it to self. The one head that is the most important in terms of the conquering of desire would be what one would call the primary sin. Clearly all of our suffering is a consequence of ignorance. And our ignorance is the result of a direct motivation of selfishness. Our sins that produce all our sufferings are not so much a problem of commission. The only reason that we did things wrong in the first place is because that we were selfish and we wanted things for ourselves. So therefore, in order to be able to conquer the desire body and to have it as a vehicle of consciousness that is completely under our control and something that we use to create rather than something that leads us around willy-nilly, is to be able to have full motivation, but to have full motivation without selfishness, where one says, I want this and I want that. The ability of the desire body to produce, or of the Lernian Hydra to produce new heads, is sort of like the nature of desire, which in itself cannot be satiated. That the more that we seek, the more that we desire something, the more desires we have, and they keep coming more and more and more. And it's only because the physical and etheric bodies can't handle it anymore that we don't keep on going with the desire body. The Lernian Hydra is quite a lethal thing. If it even just breathed on you, it could kill you. And even several days after it had walked by, if you smelled the tracks, it was enough to kill. And these snake-like or brontosaurus-like heads that it had all breathed. And I guess what we're trying to say is that desire is the primary source of our problems. Selfish desire, which causes us to do and to do and to do and to be led off astray again and again. I don't know, one can almost become defeated by it when you look at how many times you get suckered in by desire and how subtle the desires become, and after a while you can see the desires and you still can be suckered in by them. It takes it's really difficult, and it becomes lethal. In fact, the desire body in the physical body has its manifestation in the protein substances. And the proteins, you know that all organic proteins, all poisons that are poisons are organic proteins that are of organic origin. Like if you get stung by a bee, or if by a stingray, or bitten by an iguana, or all kinds of nice pictures tonight, huh? Or if you get bitten by a rattlesnake or something like that, even a spider, the poison that gets in you is an indigestible protein that can wreak havoc on your body. And so that is sort of saying that the whole principle of egoistic desire, because that protein is specific to that plant or animal that produced that poison, that kind of desire is carried even right into the physical realm. So at any rate, what Heracles does, he knows it's in its lair underneath the tree, and so he seems to lead with arrows. And his first action is he takes flaming arrows and shoots them into the underneath the tree, and that enrages the Hydra, and it comes out. And the first thing that he does is he tries again bashing it over the head, And that didn't do any good because it just caused the heads to multiply more quickly. And he's starting to engage the beast out over the swamp now. And what he does is he starts cutting heads off. And he has a special kind of sword. It's one of those swords that's not quite a sickle. You see some of them look something like this. They have a handle like that on. I forget the name of them. I think it's a falchion. I think that's the name, a falchion. Something like a sickle, and he starts cutting off heads. But when he does this, out of the swamp, this part of the story may be spurious. This huge big crab comes out of the swamp and starts nipping at him with its pincers. And what he does is he crushes it, and he stands on the crab shell and cuts off heads. And then he has to ask for help. You remember he has his one of his surviving nephews is Iolaus, who he is porter and he is charioteer, and he calls to Iolaus for help, and Iolaus has a fire ready, and he makes firebrands, or he makes faggots, and he gives them to Heracles, and as Heracles cuts the heads off, he takes the fire and he puts it on the wounds, and when he does that, immediately cutting the head off and stanching it with fire, it doesn't grow a new head. And finally he gets to the ultimate head and he cuts it off. And the strange thing is that this falchion that he has is made of gold. And it turns out that part of the head of the immortal, the center. So when he takes the golden falchion and cuts off the last head, the one that is partly gold itself, he takes it and he buries it under a stone. And this is one of the symbols that I'm still concentrating on and don't have an answer to. It goes back to something we talked about last year when we talked about the myth of Persephone. Remember when Persephone was in the underworld and she ate the seeds from the pomegranate, and she was about to be let loose. And what was his name? Asclepius. Asclepius tattletaled on her that she had eaten the pomegranate seeds. And what happened was that Demeter had him put into a hole with a stone over the top of the hole. And the same thing happens with the primary head of the Hydra that's partly gold. And I don't understand the meaning of the stone covering the hole. It's obviously a universal symbol. We're going to come up against it later on when Heracles goes into the underworld in the last labor, when he gets the hound of hell, Kerberos, and clearly it's part of the mythology of the New Testament when the stone is rolled away. Because what happens when he gets the hound of hell, while he's in the underworld, he frees Asclepius from underneath the stone. In this case, he puts the Hydra's head under the stone, and I really don't understand the meaning of it. But when we're talking about cutting something off at the head, we're talking about that this is a much different principle than was the case when we were dealing with the vital body. With the desire body, you have to get your desires right at the beginning. If you just try to beat at them like with the club, they're just going to multiply. And if you just try to hold the desire, that desire is going to come out elsewhere. You have to get the desire at its source. You have to nip it in the bud or lay the axe to the root and get it right at the beginning so that desire can be turned into some kind of positive motivation. Clearly, the golden head, the partially golden head of the learning hydra, has to do with the fact that the higher part of the desire body is made up of all unselfish things, the giving in art and the giving in altruism and the giving in philanthropy in the highest senses possible. And so that when you can nip it at the root and stanch it with fire, and fire clearly is spirit. And that is to say, the fire in this case represents literally the fire as even the exoteric Christian would say, the fire of the Holy Spirit. When one is baptized by the Holy Spirit and by fire, that means to say that the Spirit, that the Holy Spirit is, or the third attribute of the Spirit, is reflectively projected into the desire body. And when the Spirit becomes indwelling, it becomes indwelling within its own vehicle. And when that is the case, you have complete self-consciousness about desire. And so what we're talking about, the difficulty of overcoming the desire nature, which is so difficult, even when you find people like Max Heindel, a very high level of initiation, complaining about his own difficulty in dealing with desires, you know that it's not an easy, simple thing. And when one is so self-conscious, because the human spirit, which is the fire that comes down from heaven, the mana that comes down from heaven, it's called manas in some societies, when that is completely in control of its motivations, and all desires are a direct assertion of self with a capital S, that is what stanches the poisonous heads of desire and brings it to be part of our own. So the desire does have its root and it does have its mission. And after the hydra has been overcome, he disembowels it. And it's really interesting that when he disembowels it, he goes to the bladder, the gallbladder, and he dips all of his arrows in the gall, and ever after that he has a poison where even just a little scratch kills. And this is really a neat, it's so neat how the little details of the myth work out, such that if the desire body in a human being is seated in the liver, or in the area of the physical body where the liver is, and there are some parallel functions, even though they're on two different planes of existence, that the exudation of the liver is the gall, and that is the source of poison, the source of death. I don't know how to say it, but so it literally, desire of this nature really is a poison. Even to have frustrated desire in the form of anger poisons our body. So, okay, we have then realized then that this represents self-consciousness expressed in its phenomenal vehicle, the desire body, by direct intent, that what the Spirit wills is what the motivation wants to do. There is no longer then any inefficiency lost in excessive actions, as is the case when the desire body desires and desires and desires. All it does is tire us out with desiring. All right, we have looked at the first two labors that we're going to look at, and I will very briefly look at the third labor, and that is the labor of the carinarian hind. A hind is a female deer what we would call a doe, but it's a very special kind of female deer. It is a female deer that is red. You know, we have the white-tailed deer and the mule deer in the United States, and in Asia Minor they had the red deer, and in the language they called the adult female red deer was called the hind. His task, as it was set to him by Eurystheus, was to capture her alive and to bring her back to Mycenae. Now, this creature was not an ordinary red deer. It was a dappled one, which again brings on this whole idea that, remember when we looked at Susanoo and he flayed this piebald horse and he threw it down with fecal matter and stuff into where there were all the imperial spinners. We noted at that time that the piebald horse was like the ass that was used in the Eleusinian mysteries, and here we have a dappled hind, which represents the same thing. Some people claim that it represents the figures of the stars in the heavens on the hide, and that the hide represents the firmament itself, but probably what it represents is our nature. Our nature, in many ways, is not pure. We are not purely spiritual. We are not purely material. We are not purely good people. We are not purely bad people, but we're mixed. We have those mixed kinds of qualities. I'm sure there's a deeper meaning to this symbol in all of the uses that we've seen it in looking at the myths, but I'm afraid that I don't know that yet, and I can't talk about what I don't know, and if I share what I do have, then eventually more will come. But this was one of 5 hinds, and they all had brazen horns and golden hooves. They were over in Thessaly, northeast actually of Greece, and they were near the Parnassian mountains, and especially the mountain of Anarus. I don't know how to pronounce Anurus, probably Anurus. Some say that they got their brazen horns from sunlight shining on them, but all of these hinds were sacred to Artemis, and they were all caught by Artemis at one time, except this one, which she could never catch because it always ran too much. The golden horns and the brazen hooves, the horns function, according to occultists such as Rudolf Steiner, the horns function as antennae into the inner worlds. And they are related to both the etheric and desire body, and they are associated with the procreative activity. They're used not only in struggling and fighting, but in the assertion of what the psychologists would call libido in the character of an animal. A horse's mane or a lion's mane or an animal's horns are all desire etheric in their origin. And so having golden horns would relate it as an antenna to the heaven, whereas the brazen hooves related to the earth, and related to the earth in a very sinful way. This is, we spoke about the brazen pot that Eurystheus had for himself so he could hide away in fear of Heracles. And this describes the mind very well, because the mind, as we recall, Hermes was the servant of the gods, and the mind is in the center of our being, in the hourglass of our being, and part of the mind reaches up into the higher mind, which is part of the threefold spirit, and part of the mind is coalesced with the desire body producing the second self or the lower nature, and that is the seat of sin, the law of sin that is in our members, that self that just wants to do outrageous things and that revels in them. And so if the third of the labors as we're looking at them represents the mind, the high part does reach into the spirit and the low part reaches down into the sinful, harmful ways. Now, in this case, he's only to bring the Carinarian hind to Mycenae, but he is not to kill it. And this is to say that by the time that he has gotten beyond desire, or he has gotten within desire and has killed off its effects and has the selfhood right within it, he doesn't have all of the viciousness and violence within his nature, and he can now be completely harmless. And he can be a supporter, if not a creator in nature, rather than a destroyer or sort of a leech from the gods. Now, he hunts it, or you should say he stalks it, and he chases it for a year, for an entire year, representing an entire cycle of destiny. And he goes all over chasing this. In fact, he goes as far as Hyperborea and beyond. What we see here is another use of the ladder of the stars. Because we've laid the ladder of the stars on the earth, and Hyperborea, let me draw an earth on here. That's the equator, and we have all these belts. Hyperborea was right next to Polaris, and Polaris was the land of the pole. And if he got beyond Hyperborea, he got to the top of the ladder of the stars. Which doesn't mean all of his labors are over, but in effect he's getting beyond the human state which is associated with earth. Meaning to say that when you're out of your mind, in the spiritual sense, you've really accomplished something. You can then function totally in the spirit. And we're talking about something more here than just the lesser mysteries, but when we're doing this in a vehicular way, and doing it in giant steps, that's the kind of thing that we get. So that the land of the Hyperboreans was either England or Iceland to the ancient Greeks, and they were considered that the deepest of wisdom came from there, and the deepest hierophants of the mysteries were to be found in the land of the Hyperboreans. And so this means that literally the chase, which is, you're chasing your own thoughts, you're chasing your own mind, is what is involved in the capture of the Carinarian hind. It's you have to go at it. So if the rim of the wheel or the belly of the earth in the physical is at the equator, and at the pole is at the head of it, the spiritual things come from the poles down to the equator. All philosophies come from the poles, whereas all forms, like corn, our corn has come from the equator and has migrated north, and now succulents are migrating north from the equator. So there is a twofold thing, just sort of like the flow of introversion and extroversion, that even on the surface of the earth that there is a duplicate of what happens in the higher inner worlds. So at any rate, he chases the hind until he tires it out. I don't believe you can really tire the mind out, but you can not excite it anymore. You know what I'm trying to say? I'm not encouraging this notion of blank thinking, but after a while you realize that there's only so much that the mind can do, and you tire of having the mind be like an incessant rattlebox. And I'm not just talking about the brain-mind kind of nervous thinking that most people do all the time. I'm even talking about higher thinking. And in order to get a control of the mind, you have to get beyond it. You have to get around to the other side of it. That's the way you actually get within it. And now he actually traces it until it gets tired out. And there are 3 versions to how he catches it. In one version, he shoots an arrow. He always leads with arrows. He shoots an arrow and he gets it right in the back between the tendon and the leg where there is strong connective tissue, and he pierces through both front legs, and it sticks into a tree. Not a drop of blood flows, so he's been harmless. That's one version. The other version is that he throws a net around it and catches it in a net, and yet another version is that he catches it when it's asleep, and he grabs it, and when it's caught asleep, he can get it alive. You just walk up on it. Now there are a number of ways that you can look at. If you look at it, pinning it with one arrow, I think has something to do with the very center of the center of the center in the mind is the archetypal thought of thinking itself. Thinking about thinking and thinking about thinking as a vehicle for manifest creative thinking, for manifest creative activity. In the spirit, things are accomplished by unifying things and by bringing them together. You might say an idea, a complex idea, is accomplished by bringing together other ideas, but when they become manifest into the external phenomenal worlds, they do so by the idea that this could be, or that this could become, and that becomes the nexus of all thinking altogether. And the piercing with one arrow without killing represents this getting right to the very heart of the mind. And when you are then at that, where this is where ideas become thoughts. And if you get control of your mind right at the very, where all thoughts come into being, then you can anticipate and you can choose what kind of thoughts you actually wish to have happen. Because if otherwise it's like chasing the hind altogether. You know, if you try to stop bad thoughts, or if you try to correct thoughts, it's like chasing an arrow once you shot it. It's off and gone. You can't do it. And in order to pin it down, you have to get at that area where not a bit of creative blood, none of the creative stuff is lost, but you're right where all thoughts begin. The center of that, in a way, is aligned, if not coincident, with the center of the mind is an archetype that creates archetypes, and it's associated with the primordial archetype, which we've looked at as being a very complex spiral. And if you look at the crossings of the spiral, sort of like when you look at those pictures of satellites or they cross the Earth and such like that, a net. So all 3 stories are eventually the same story. You know what I'm trying to say? That the shooting with one arrow is getting at the crux of things, but that one arrow hits right in the center of the primordial atom, and the center of the primordial atom with that complex lemniscate spiral surrounding it looks like it is netted in the center. And you'll catch it when it's asleep. Meaning to say that one thing that occurred, that is said so many times in the New Testament of the Bible, where Christ says, it cometh like a thief in the night, and it gets caught sleeping. Meaning to say that when you have the transcendental experience, you are in a realm that is so exciting, but it's so thick with excitement that relatively speaking to this world, it seems solid and it seems completely and utterly peaceful. The dove of peace, which is the dove of the Holy Spirit, is, that's one and the same thing. So when one is at that state where there is complete peace, that is where one can prediscriminate what thoughts are going to come into manifestation and which ones are not. So catching the hind asleep with a net or an arrow are all the same story. Now, that's about it for what we want to say, because there are some alternate versions. Some say that this hind was had something to do with one of the Pleiades, but that would be getting too far into trouble. There's one little sideline to the story that I think is very pretty, very beautiful, is that when he's chasing the hind and he's just about to catch it, Artemis comes and rebukes him. I think even after he's caught it, I think it is. She rebukes him because this animal is sacred to her, and she's going to want her tribute in this. And he says, it wasn't I that did it, it was Eurystheus. Now this is really ironic, and the truth is always ironic, because that's one of the chief means of the lower nature. The lower nature always has the lie, and it always lives the lie. And it wasn't I that, how does Euripides say it? It wasn't I, but my tongue that lied. And it always blames it on something else. Or this is what God wanted me to do. And the irony of the matter is that Heracles, who represents the hero, or who represents self in the higher sense, represents the initiate, the true spiritual being, he can literally and honestly say it wasn't I who commanded this, it was Eurystheus who commanded it, meaning to say that sin belongs to the lower nature, it doesn't belong to the divine part of our being. And when we have risen to this state, to this level that we've gotten beyond the mind, this is the level of being a true creative being. You are then at the greater mysteries in the modern sense of the word greater mysteries. You're beyond the mind, and then you can say that sin belongs to the realm of Eurystheus, and that is that way, and you can't blame me anymore, and there is a kind of a blameless quality. So we've looked at the first three labors, and we've looked at them more as greater initiations than as lesser initiations, because within each of these activities there are many stages. So what we're going to do now is, in a very fast swoop, with just a few comments here and there, tell a bunch of stories next time. But I'm not absolutely certain I'm going to be able to. You may all get phone calls between now and next Thursday, because I might not be able to make it, because next Wednesday I have an engagement, and I'm doing a lot of astrological work both Saturday and Sunday for people, and so I may not get a chance to put together a talk for next week, but it'll be something like this, short, with more storytelling, less philosophization. Yes, they're going to be on the labors. They're going to be, hopefully if I could get through it, I would like to do a good 6 or 7 of them. I'd like to do the last 4 in one session, because I want to treat the first 3 one way, and then the next 5 another way, and then the final ones, the final 4, another way. Any questions? I realize that this was rather thin, but I just wanted to hit the central features of working with each of the vehicles. All right. So in a week.